Hey everyone. Um, so I was thinking about covering the presidential debate that happened a couple days ago. I was really close to, but I'm not sure. Like, I'm still kind of stewing on that, and I'd rather other people who have been following the election a little more closely. I mean, I've been busy with law school, so I've been following to the best of my ability, but I'm going to let other people talk about that right now. What I want to talk about instead is a subject that I've wanted to cover on my channel for a little while. And this is something that I've been stewing on uh, for as, not for as long as I can remember, since I first moved down to the South about 5 or so years ago, right? And essentially, I mean, I assume it's what I put in the title. It's the nature of the far right abusing religion as rhetoric, right? I thought a lot about this. Now, mind you, it's a Friday, and I've had a long week, but I've got my tea, I've got some coffee as well, so I feel like I am properly prepared to have this discussion. And a lot of it will be from my own personal experience, and I'll supplement with since the nature is sort of religion and the intersection of religion and politics, it is what I studied, so I'll supplement a little bit of what I've learned and what I've studied, but not to any extent like I'm holding myself out as any sort of expert, only to the extent that I have personal knowledge on the things I'll be talking about. Um, so yeah, uh, when I first when I went to college, I went to college. I mentioned it here before. I went to college at a small liberal arts school in Memphis, Tennessee. Why I went there is another story, and honestly, sometimes I look back in hindsight and I'm like, Riley, what were you thinking? But there are a lot of factors that played in. It was a really good school, especially for the things I wanted to study. They offered me a wonderful financial aid package, and that made it a lot easier on my family. A lot of considerations like that played into that decision. Um, when I moved down there, and I mentioned this a little bit on the other channel, so I won't go into the nature of how it started so much. Um, but eventually, I got into a really my first major relationship in my life. Perhaps this subject also came to mind because right now I'm currently talking to someone, and if you're watching, hi. Um, but yeah, uh, I don't know. Maybe just us talking has made me think more about the nature of this relationship that had such an impact on my life. So I hope that doesn't make you uncomfortable. It doesn't. That's not my intention. Um, but anyway, with this relationship, it was when I was presenting as a guy. Because in case you didn't know, I am trans. Shocker. Um, And when I was in college, for a good amount of the time I was there, I presented as guy for a combination of reasons that either I've already partially covered or we can cover another day. Let me know if you want me to. Um, and so when I was down there, I got into a relationship, my first serious relationship with a Southern, it's sort of your traditional Southern belle sort of girl, right? Um, one of the I mean, to put it succinctly, one of the best people I've ever known. Um, and one of the people who I've been closest to in my life and who I have historically trusted the most. Um, which is really what sort of spurred my thinking about religion in a very critical way when I was in the South, right? I've mentioned before briefly on my experiences being Christian and trans. Just that, I have a different experience from a lot of people who are LGBT and who have experiences with faith when they're younger. And that for the most part, people who are LGBT have largely negative experiences. And that's completely understandable, right? Because unfortunately, we live in a society where we live in a society. We live in a society where there is, like, Christianity is very widespread as a faith, but particularly Christianity in such a sense that it is construed to be more of a bludgeoning tool, a way to induce guilt in people and conformity via guilt. And a lot of people who are queer and have to deal with that growing up can have some really traumatic experience, right? And so when they're finally able to get away from their hometown or wherever they came from, where they're subjected to that sort of trauma, then, you know, they kind of say, well, fuck you, religion, what'd you ever do for me? Right? And that's completely understandable. I just happened to come from, by pure chance, a town where religion really wasn't that important to people. I mean, it was sort of important, but in sort of a Midwest, you know, most people go to church like a couple times a year and otherwise don't really care. The religion in the town I came from was football, right? Which I talked about in another video, which I did get involved in, right? Again, another video that I made, you can check that out if you want to learn more. But, so it was really very interesting to me. I mean, I knew that before I went to college in the South, I was aware that there were a lot of people in America who construed the Bible in such a way as it was very harmful and negative and used as a bludgeoning tool and all that, right? And there are lots of people on YouTube and other platforms who have like rigorously documented and gone through like all the ways that people like this will abuse the Bible as a way, as different forms of rhetoric, and, you know, and basically have deconstructed those rhetorical tools and shown why they're faulty. And I recommend that you go watch those videos. Again, like, that's not really what I'm going to be talking about. I guess the best way to put it is that I'm sort of going to be speaking to the effect of those rhetorical tools on people from these communities. Because this girl that I met, who I loved, right? I still maintain this belief today, even after everything that we've been through, because, spoiler, the TLDR, I came out to her as trans and our relationship ended. And we really haven't spoken since, outside of one or two very rare occasions, right? And, you know, I still deal with that trauma. We were together for a long time, and I cared about her a lot, and I still do care about her in the sense I want her to be happy. But I also continue to wonder what things led to us splitting apart, right? What led to the end of what was a very, you know, one of the best things in my life. And I've gone through a lot of explanations, right? I've resolved a lot in my head. I blame myself a lot of the time. I blame myself for a very long time. That I should have told her sooner, that I should have come out to her sooner. You know, I blame myself for that for a while. But, you know, I've also, and you can take whatever opinion you want. I'm not going to try to prescribe to you an opinion on this. But a lot of people have told me, Riley, that's absurd. You shouldn't blame yourself for how she reacts to you, obviously holding back something that is, you know, that you have every reason and right to. At least while you're, you know, figuring out how to deal with it in an appropriate way, right? A lot of people have told me that. And I believe that more nowadays. But then I still have to wonder why did it have to be such that I lost this person who was so important to me? And why did I lose her family? When I was dating her, and for the time I was engaged to her, her family was as close to me as my own flesh and blood, right? When I was living in the South, I would go over to their house every day. Or not every day, every weekend. They lived an hour away from my school, and so I would drive out there every single weekend. And I would just be a part of their family, right? And it was good for me because it was a family that was especially close with each other and offered me sort of a spot in it, right? And I felt loved, and I felt, you know, like I was for all intents and purposes, and for however they consider it, I believed them to be my family. And I believed them, and I still believe them to be good people, right? And so it's really hard for me to reconcile. It's really hard for me to reconcile this fact that I consider these some of the best people that I know, that I've known. And yet, just by virtue of the fact that I am trans or LGBT or whatever, that I can't have a relationship with them anymore. There's a book that I read a while ago when I was in college. It's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Disagree on Religion and Politics, right? I first read that during college when I was sort of dealing with this issue in sort of a premature stage, right? When I was worried about losing them. And essentially what the book talks about is this idea of, well, ideology. And it talks about this idea that people who have certain religious values and beliefs, when they maintain those values, it is extremely difficult for those ideas to coexist in a world with ideas or evidence that may exist to the contrary, and to react in a constructive manner. What do I mean by that? If you live in a world where you believe that, where your central worldview is structured around a certain type of marriage or a certain type of gender heteronormativity, and that's what you've grown up with and that's what you've known, people do not respond to contrarying ideas with constructive criticism, right? They take it as a personal affront, as a personal attack on their being, right? And it is very hard to overcome that. Now, is that necessarily an excuse? Not necessarily, because it still sort of presents this problem of, oh, well, the main issue is that they are ignorant. They choose not to acknowledge these other things and to reconcile. They choose not to reconcile my existence with their preconceived notions of faith or heteronormativity or whatever it may be, right? For a while, that's sort of where I was at mentally. And that's actually why I ended up undertaking an honors thesis looking exactly at how political ideology influences interpretations of the Bible, right? And there's a lot of evidence that shows that most Christians don't care about people who are LGBT or people who want to engage in same-sex marriage or what have you. It's mainly people who are in, these more Baptist and, oh my god, the term is escaping me. Essentially terms that really don't follow any sort of national or otherwise large structure. churches which afford a lot of latitude to individual congregations to be able to do sort of what they want with the scripture, right? Which obviously creates a really big risk of people, of, especially pastors or people who are members of those communities abusing the scripture, right? And so that's sort of what my research in undergrad looked at. My mentality was, maybe if I'm able to just show these people empirically, that their beliefs are informed by people abusing their authority in order to try and bias you, and that you don't have to take the Bible to be such a negative tool. Maybe if I can show you this, then I don't know, I can reconcile your understanding, maybe repair or preempt losing you. And ultimately that didn't really come to fruition. I got my, I finished my research. I got honors, graduated with honors and all that, right? But I still ended up, I came out to Carly, and that was it. And I've struggled with that for a while, right? This idea, and I mean, like, in this sense, I do have some relatability to people who lost their family when they came out, if they grew up in, like, conservative religious families, because I lost a lot of people who I did consider my family, people who I loved very dearly and still do care about, even if they might not care about me. Recently, there's a psychological model that my friend introduced me to that has helped give me some other ways of looking at this circumstance and this situation, right? There is a psychological model that exists, and it's called the spiral dynamics model, right? And essentially what this model is it's a model that maps out essentially the evolution of the human consciousness, right? Both from a long-term historical sense, but also just being able to give people who are familiar with the model a degree of vocabulary with which to be able to recognize where other people are in that model, who live in our society, right? Because not everyone in our society is along that same degree, not everyone in society is at the same stage of psychological development. And that's not, that's not me being judgmental of the people who are less developed. The same way that you don't judge a child for not being as knowledgeable as someone who's grown up a little bit more, right? Everyone grows at their own pace, and some people only ever reach one point or one stage in the model and don't advance beyond it, and that's fine, right? But this model has helped me to be able to recognize a little bit more about where this family is at, and how I've been able to reconcile sort of the ideas which are in direct conflict with each other. One, that they're able to maintain, very hateful ideas about my existence, and also the fact that I think that they're still good people. Again, a lot of people, a lot of viewers might disagree with that notion. But this is the basic idea, right? The basic idea is that a lot of these people are at a stage in the model, and if you want to, after, you can either pause, or after this video you can go watch, there's a series on YouTube about them, on all the different stages of the model. So there's one video, the first video in the series, called Stage Blue, right? And there's a lot to say about that stage of psychological development. But the short and easy version of it is basically just that. That is such a stage in psychological development where people are largely organized around this idea of the collective above the self, right? Especially in ideas of nationalism, especially in ideas of faith, right? And especially in ideas of family, right? Certain blue concepts are like God and country, right? And you see a large rise of faith, but more specifically, faith with a focus on guilt and conformity, right? Faith in such a way that society organizes around it, that society is expected to adhere to the principles strictly with very loose room for interpretation. And even if you might disagree with it, you are supposed to follow it or else risk some form of punishment, whether that be in the form of social ostracization or divine punishment in the form of like smiting or being sent to hell, right? You see this form of religion a lot in early colonialism in America, over in medieval Europe, and for a long time throughout history. The only time you really don't, at least if we're talking about Christianity, is like when Christ was alive, because those are, if you read the gospel, those are really the only ideas in the Bible that are not blue, right? The short and simple is that they're much more green and yellow, which are much higher versions, much higher stages on the scale or on the model that focus more on relatedness and faith as a means to be able to explore and deepen relationships with one another, right? There's a big difference. And so it's interesting because with this sort of understanding, I can look at these people and sort of see how it unfolds, right? You have a lot of people who are born into a culture that's largely blue. You're in the South, you live in a small town, you come from a family that follows the Bible strictly, and so did their family before them and before them and before them. It's how you structure your life, and you're taught that you need to strictly follow that structure. You're taught that it is the most important thing in the world growing up. And even if you might otherwise be a good person, even if you might otherwise want to help people, those feelings are often condemned as temptation, and you should feel guilty about them, right? It's a hard place to be in, because if you are stuck in that sort of a situation, then it can be especially difficult for you to be able to dig out, because it requires you to some extent to recognize that there are flaws in the structure of your faith, at least as you follow it. And of course, the religion itself, especially in the very strict environments, is construed in such a way where that sort of thinking is explicitly admonished, right? Think of the devil, who questioned God and got the worst punishment in history, right? If you begin to question the structure of how your society is organized, if you begin to question the structure in which your society is organized according to your faith, then you're considered a heretic and you'll be ostracized, and that's extremely difficult for people to do, right? Even if you might otherwise have sympathies for people who are punished according to that faith, right? according to the strict laws of its enforcement. That's an extremely difficult thing to do, and it requires a very high degree of self-recognition and exploration and sort of this realization that, you know, this faith, at least how it's being taught to me, doesn't really seem to work in application, in that I'm being told that I need to love, but in order to fulfill that in the way that you're telling me to, I need to hate. And that seems impossible for me to reconcile. And so there must be something else. What happens to a lot of people at this stage is that that's when they move to stage orange, which is and the big hallmark is secularism. That's when people usually say, well, fuck religion, fuck this shit. And you see religion come back up at later stages of the model, and that's a topic for another day. But it's relevant here because this framing helps us see a lot of why people on the far right really focus on Christianity, especially as a means to advocate for ideas, especially using heavy propaganda, right? On the last video I did, where we talked about Nikki tutorials and coming out, we saw that there was even a comment on the video that was something to the effect of, you know, confess your sins to God and He will heal you, you know, yada yada, sinner, yada yada, damnation, and so on. And you can see sort of how this comes into being with people who believe themselves to be good people, right? There are people who come from backgrounds that are very susceptible to that way of thinking. There are people who have grown up in situations which are, you know, very where they're taught that this is the only way to believe, this is the way, the truth, and the life, you know, summer camp and all that. Or stuff that, you know, songs that they teach little kids at like Christian summer camps. Trust me, I know. I went to a couple. And with Carly, it's hard because I look at her and I see someone who is so close to being on the cusp of realizing that this does not work as a way of believing, as a way of thinking, but who isn't able to overcome this hump, who is distraught because it means that if she is going to acknowledge that I am worth staying with, it might mean that she has to give up everything else. It might mean that her community and the people who loved her growing up effectively, you know, might shun her, right? It's very similar to what someone who is worried about coming out fears, in that I was afraid of losing everyone who I loved, right? When I did. And as people who, you know, have come out before and who know that struggle, that fear of losing people, that can in and of itself drive your entire life decisions, or the entirety of them. And so I look at these people who have had such a major impact on my life, who have given me a lot of really good memories, even if they've also given me some bad ones. And what I do is I try my best to be able to retain those memories, the good ones, as well as the bad, to be able to grow from the bad ones, and to be able to deepen my understanding of the world around me, and also to just be able to remember the good ones fondly, because they were good. And yeah, I don't know if there's any more explanation than that. They were good, and I want to remember them as good. I want to make a clarification. This is not a calling for you to be nicer to people who are far-right conservative Christian, necessarily. This is not a call to necessarily forgive them if they've wronged you. If you've been harmed, then I do not want to take away from your pain, right? It's very real, it's valid, and you can do what you want with it, right? I'm not trying to disvalue you. What this is a call to recognize that what we are dealing with here are people who, unfortunately, are a lot more like children than they are like adults. They're people who don't come from circumstances in life such that they are able to understand or sympathize with people who have lives that differ from their pre-existing religious worldview. And being able to just recognize that and to be able to construe your understanding of especially national politics accordingly, I think is going to greatly increase your understanding of why the nation is the way that it is and ways to be able to deal with that. To that extent, I recommend that you watch that video on spiral dynamics, especially Stage Blue, because that video talks a lot, and I won't rehash it here, but it talks a lot about the things that cause someone to evolve from one stage to another, in this case from stage blue to orange, right? And in that sense, we might be able to help people grow. I suppose that's more, you know, an admirational or like an aspiration than anything. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I've also wanted to present these ideas because I do want, I wanted to acknowledge this idea that a lot of people, myself included, like I'll say this sometimes, joking in passing, especially if you're from like the West Coast or the Northeast or wherever, everyone wants to say that people from the South are terrible, right? Everyone wants to say that people from the South are like the most homophobic, racist, sexist, whatever. And there are things which lend those ideas to be more true than not, but it's also a very complicated situation. It's not ever really an accurate thing to say that someone is a quote-unquote good or bad person. People are complicated. And I think that people from minority backgrounds especially can probably recognize that, because a lot of people just want to say one word, just want to give sweeping assumptions and statements about a lot of us, right? People want to probably say that I'm a bad person, or that I'm like a sex addict, or like fucking a deviant, or whatever. Like people probably, like there's a ton of people out there who want to just dismiss me entirely because of one characteristic of mine. And because of that, I tend to have more sympathy for anyone who comes from other situations. People in the South have a lot of bad ideas. A lot of them. None of which are defendable. But I don't think that there's no hope for them. Yeah. I think it would be incorrect to say that there is still no hope for them. That's it. I'm sorry if this was a little more controversial of a topic This is something which is close to my heart, but if you want to talk about it more, comment below. If you liked this sort of closer up, full screen format, or you have any criticisms, let me know. If you have other ideas for video topics, let me know, because I also want to be able to touch on like relevant topics that people are interested in. All right. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. I hope that you got something good from it. And yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye, fam.